Hello everybody, welcome to the Monday morning live stream Introduction to Philosophy and Theory lecture. My name is Julian. I'm just gonna adjust the camera for one moment here. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Hello, I hope that you're having a wonderful start to your week so far, whether you are joining me on YouTube or Instagram. Hello Instagram, hello YouTube. If you're new here, this is a weekly live stream lecture that I've been hosting for the past 3 years now, dedicated to philosophy and theory. They're supposed to be accessible introductions without dumbing them down, so we try to retain the complexity of the ideas, but I try to make them accessible nevertheless. I see people joining us from Croatia, the Philippines. Thank you so much. It makes me very happy when you drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. That is truly, truly wonderful. I see Thailand, hello, greetings. I see Sarajevo, hello, Italy. I'm currently in the Bay Area in California, near Berkeley, sort of right between Berkeley and the coast in the Albany area. I'm going to be here for about a week or so. And today I would like to dedicate an entire session to talking about one of the more controversial, but I think interesting perspectives or arguments within the philosophy of Slavoj Žižek, specifically relating to his theology. And so the title of this lecture is going to be The Monstrosity of Christ, i.e. the obscene core of Christianity, in which I would like to try to explain some of Žižek's key positions when it comes to Christianity. I should note, if you're coming into this without any previous knowledge of Žižek's works, this is not a criticism or a critique of Christianity as such. In fact, it's not an atheism. Instead, it's a philosophical, if you will, German idealist, Hegelian, psychoanalytic argument about Christianity, specifically about the New Testament. And so we're going to be talking about G.K. Chesterton, we're going to be talking about Žižek. I'd like to briefly address Slavoj Žižek's interpretation of the Kung Fu Panda movie, which some of you may already know about, but I think is worth noting in this context. And so there's a whole bunch of ideas that are going to be brought into the mix here. So if you'd like to join, feel free to make yourself comfortable for the next, 40, 45 minutes or so. If you'd like to download any of these sessions, I post all of the audio files to my Patreon, so you can download the lectures on Patreon. And I should also note that there is an ebook subscription service on Patreon. So basically, every 3 months, I release a corresponding ebook for the lectures that you can download on Patreon. And so if you can't follow all the lectures, you can basically follow them in writing. A huge thank you, by the way, to all the patrons who keep this project alive. I really would not be able to do this without your generous support. And what's most important to me is that these lectures are open access and available for everyone online. That brings me so much joy that we get to share this space around the world. So thank you to the patrons who give me the financial support to keep lecturing independently online. Huge thank you. If you'd like to join our community of patrons and help me keep hosting these lectures and posting content, please consider going to www.patreon.com/Julian Philosophy. Okay, so let's dive right in. Slavoj Žižek has a fairly notorious argument about Christianity, in which he describes himself as a Christian atheist. And I think what I'd like to do in this session is I'd like to explain what Žižek means by Christian atheism, how it relates to some core ideas within G.K. Chesterton's work. And then from there, I think we can make an argument about what that means from a Hegelian perspective. So, one of Žižek's most provocative arguments is that the best, and for him only way, to be a Christian today is to be a so-called Christian atheist. Now, in order to understand that, you have to understand what Žižek means by Christian atheism. Essentially, Žižek argues that to properly interpret, according to him, the event of the crucifixion, the New Testament, is to take into account the possibility of a suffering God. In fact, Žižek comes up with a trifecta of sorts, a triad, which is not that of the Trinity, but that of three different interpretations of God. First, we have the idea of a cosmic God, of unity and omnipotence. God is in everything. God is beauty, etc. This is juxtaposed with the Old Testament God of wrath, the God who is vengeful, who wipes out civilization, who essentially imposes his law and his order upon man. And Zizek says that we have to contrast these two notions of God, the mystical primordial deity, and the wrathful, vengeful God, with a third deity, a third stage, if you will, which is perhaps the most radical one, which is the idea of a suffering God, of a God who is either impotent or silent. And it's hard to decide which one is worse. Is it worse to have a deity who is considered impotent, who can't act on our behalf? Or is it worse to conceive of a God who is silent, who therefore perhaps chooses not to act on our behalf? Now, of course, this isn't an idea that Zizek himself comes up with. It's an idea that he identifies, has been identified by others as well, but that he takes directly from the work of G.K. Chesterton, who you may perhaps know from the Father Brown detective series. And the argument can be simplified, but it can also be made more complex. The simplest version of the argument is the realization that in Christ on the cross, we have a God who suffers on behalf of Christ, who therefore suffers on behalf of us, who in a strange and radical sense becomes complicit in our lives. The more complicated way of explaining it is that you could make a juxtaposition between the atheist logic and the New Testament logic. The atheist logic, namely the death of God, formulated, for example, by Nietzsche, would be that God is dead, and that therefore we are left to our own devices. Modern man in a godless world has to seek the groundings and the foundations for his own existence. Therefore, to be alive in a post-God world means to be lost, but therefore to have the opportunity to find yourself. This means that from an atheist position, God is dead, leaving us like children, as it were. Hence also the famous line, if God didn't exist, there would be the need to invent one, essentially. The death of God for Nietzsche isn't something that is declared triumphantly. It's declared as a predicament, which is something that you will also see then reverberating within absurdism, which relates in that sense to nihilism as well. If nothing means anything, then perhaps this is the only meaning that there is. Nothing means anything. Now, juxtaposed with this atheist position, which belies the death of God precipitating the birth of an autonomous man, we have the position of the New Testament, the idea of the suffering God. Now, the suffering God doesn't die so that humanity can live, as it were. The idea of the suffering God is precisely that the death of God is staged for God himself. That God dies on the cross as the omnipotent Father in the sky, precisely so as to actualize himself in and through man. Or to put it in Hegelian terms, we have here a form of sublation. What therefore appears to be the demise of God is in fact the universalization of the deity. Similar, of course, to how within the crucifixion, what appears to be the descent of Christ, or perhaps even in worldly terms, the failure of Christ, is precisely both his redemption and thereby the redemption of man and God in man on earth. The Trinity, therefore, and the famous idea of the Holy Spirit, is not about three separate things, but about three things existing in one. It's a splitting that therefore performs a unification. It's a dialectical movement. It's a sublation of sorts. Now, the reason that I'm introducing this here is that it helps us understand two of Zizek's very provocative arguments about religion. One, that there is an obscene core to Christianity, and two, that there is a monstrosity to Christ. Now, these are two positions that I'd like to clarify in the following couple of minutes in a very sort of schematic way, because it serves to be clear here, I think. Both of these arguments, once again, are derived from the work of G.K. Chesterton, specifically his work Orthodoxy. The work Orthodoxy itself follows a fictional tale about a secret organization of anarchists led by a man called Sunday, where it turns out eventually that all of the members of the secret anarchist organization are themselves detectives who believe that they are working undercover, trying to fight the very thing they are. We can return to that later, but it's a delicious story. The Man Called Thursday, I should mention. Now, I'm going to explain first the monstrosity of Christ, and then the obscene core of Christianity, because they're both really interesting ideas. The monstrosity of Christ is the notion that Christ, as Redeemer, seems monstrously inept. This, of course, is the Roman position, and even the Gentile position, which is to say, Christ, how can Christ be the Savior? How can this man claim to save all if he cannot even save himself? This is how Christ is, of course, mocked as a false prophet, as a false king, wearing the crown of thorns, excuse me. Therefore, the figure of Christ, at first glance, as the representative or figuration of a godly ideal, not just as the Son of God, but as God, appears by necessity monstrously inadequate. Therefore, from Chesterton's position, the monstrosity of Christ is therefore precisely that he is an ordinary man, that he is not someone who seems to be in any way elevated above anyone else. One understands, once again, the Roman and Gentile mockery, looking at Christ and saying, this guy, how is this guy supposed to save you? He doesn't look impressive. He doesn't have money. He doesn't have big muscles. He doesn't have telekinetic powers. How is this ordinary, pathetic, weak man supposed to save you? Now, of course, from a theological position, it's precisely this ordinariness, this ineptness, that marks the truly revolutionary character of the figure of Christ. Which is to say that Christ isn't the one who liberates or sets other people free by means of severing their chains directly. Christ instead, in his own defeat, as it were, creates the conditions for his universal victory, which is to make other people realize the chains of their own making. It's a little bit like the idea of the Hegelian authentic master, which in the past I've likened to Luffy, the character from One Piece, the protagonist. The idea of the Hegelian authentic master is never the one who has the power to necessarily set other people free. Or perhaps if he has the power, this is not his inclination. Think about how in One Piece, at a certain point, Luffy, the boy who would be Pirate King, is asked why he wants to be Pirate King. And his answer is not, I want to be Pirate King so that I'm the most powerful, which wouldn't be possible in the first place. After all, you can't become Pirate King lest you are already the most powerful. It's a very Hegelian notion in the sense that once you are it, you have already become it. It's a little bit like in Christopher Nolan's film Tenet, in which the man who believes himself to be working for the protagonist finds himself to be the protagonist. the man who recruited him therefore becomes himself in the future. Whereas what happens in One Piece is that Luffy says, I don't want to be Pirate King because I want to be the most powerful man alive. He says, I want to be the most free man alive. Therefore, the ideal is to be someone who is so incredibly, determinately free that he is therefore the most powerful. And this is the key when it comes to One Piece, which is that the underlying message here is that Luffy never sets other people free by means of liberating them directly. Instead, he demonstrates to them what true freedom looks like. And therefore, people want to become free in his own image. They realize that they too have the capacity to live, to be free, to live for something, which are therefore synonymous with each other. Namely, to live for something is to be truly free, which leads us back to a Chestertonian maxim, which is that every act of will is strictly speaking an act of self-limitation. After all, to be free, you have to know what you want to do, which means that you have to know what you don't want to do. Therefore, the primordial act of freedom is the choice to live for something, i.e. to choose that you would be willing to die for something, and therefore not to do other things. This means that at the very heart of freedom lies a radical decision as to what is worth doing with your life, what it is that you are willing to die for. And the idea that you could do lots of little things a little bit without committing to any of them would thereby become a form of constriction. This is similar to a beautiful idea that Kierkegaard has, the Danish philosopher, where he says that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. That freedom, if it is conceived of universally as the capacity to do anything, therefore quickly becomes its opposite, a binding restriction that doesn't allow you to do anything. It's like you're sitting alone in your room thinking about all the things that you could be doing, and yet in contemplating that and in refusing to make a decision, you risk doing none of them. Therefore, interestingly enough, to be truly free is to give yourself completely to one thing, to one idea, to one project, to one life, as it were. What Luffy in One Piece therefore models is this unbound freedom, this, if you will, irrational, foolish determination to do what he believes is right without thinking about it logically or reasonably. And it's precisely this reckless, indeed naive and foolish, and therefore revolutionary fervor that Luffy has in One Piece that allows other people to see the possibilities and therefore have the imagination as to what their life might be and to seize it as if it were their own. Therefore, Luffy doesn't set other people free by means of his power to do so. It's that he himself is so unconditionally free that his freedom is reflected back unto others. This is the fundamental act of revolutionary emancipation. Emancipation is never to free people from their chains, but to make people realize their chains so that they too would like to be free. And ironically, to make this a contemporary polemic for a moment, to live in a so-called supposedly post-ideological world is to consider ourselves free, but for the very mechanisms by which we're supposed to actualize this freedom, namely consumption and travel and all manner of participation in the surplus economy of enjoyment, what we call late-stage capitalism, therefore precisely creates anxiety, or what Marx would call alienation. And so now we're back at Kierkegaard's maxim that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. We could make a Marxist twist on this and say that freedom is the dizziness of capitalism, as it were. Freedom, therefore, becomes synonymous with the anxiety, i.e. the alienation of capitalism. And so instead of saying that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, alienation becomes the dizziness of the free subject, or supposedly free subject, within capitalism. Now, to go back to Luffy for a moment, in One Piece, there's a certain trope that we find within One Piece, which I'm inclined to call the trope of the drunken master. And the trope of the drunken master within Kung Fu cinema is the idea that there's a character who appears very weak i.e. inebriated, he has been drinking. And yet it's precisely in his state of drinking, of being in flow, that he proves himself to be a monstrously good combatant, that every blow that the enemy tries to land, he is able to counter in ingenious ways that somehow, through his very drunkenness, in other words, through his absence of technique and skill, therefore make him a master. And Luffy has elements of this. Luffy has elements of the drunken master, where his fighting doesn't correspond to the structural mechanisms or incentive structures of how other people live their lives. And this is where I think we should make a leap to Slavoj Žižek's interpretation of Kung Fu Panda, which I think should be seen in the light of the drunken master. In Kung Fu Panda, we have Po, who is a seemingly inept noodle maker, noodle salesman, noodle chef, who doesn't wish to become someone who sells noodles for the rest of his life. In the vernacular of the film, he has not yet had the noodle dream, the dream which signifies his adulthood, of course in a slightly vulgar Freudian sense, but also in his capacity to take on the the small business of his adopted father. Now, the reason that Slavoj Žižek is interested in Kung Fu Panda, apart from this drunken master or authentic master element, whereby Po, by means of highly unorthodox means, becomes a very good combatant or Kung Fu master, what Žižek is specifically interested in is the idea of the dragon scroll in the film, which has a central role in the storytelling mechanism. The dragon scroll is supposed to be a secretive scroll that contains some arcane wisdom that will grant the reader immense powers. And therefore, to read the scroll is both an act of enlightenment and, if you will, an act of heresy. It's too much power for any individual. The villain, of course, the antagonist in the film, wants to read the scroll to make the powers his own. Now, spoilers for Kung Fu Panda, but Po, eventually, towards the third act of the film, reads the scroll. He breaks the seal and he reads it. And he, of course, discovers that there is nothing in the scroll. There's nothing written in it. There's no transformative power that is immediately transferred to him. Therefore, at first sight, the scroll appears to be a fraud. In fact, using the language of this argument I've been making, one might go as far as saying that the scroll appears to be monstrous, horribly inept, inadequate. What is supposed to be the object that brings enlightenment, that represents a divinity, if you will, suddenly appears to be empty, devoid of any ideal content, once again, monstrous, or at least monstrously inept. And of course, it is at this very moment that what at first appeared to be the barrier to Poe's success as a fighter, namely his clumsiness and his interest in food, suddenly, when seen from the other side, becomes the very precondition for his success. Which is to say that for Poe, success is not overcoming failure. It is, in a sense, failure refracted upon itself. Namely, Poe becomes, in a wonderfully animated, witty, funny, and highly action-packed sequence, he becomes the drunken master, as it were. He becomes the dragon master. He realizes that there is no scroll which will teach him how to be the ideal fighter, but that he is already the ideal fighter. That his fighting simply doesn't exist within the existing incentive structures of what is considered kung fu. Therefore, Poe emancipates himself. He becomes a very successful kung fu master inadvertently by means of creating his own style of fighting, which, spoilers again for Kung Fu Panda, allow him to defeat the antagonist. Now, strictly speaking, we have here two different positions apropos the ideal object. The antagonist believes that the scroll contains the secret, to mastery and therefore becomes a villain. He himself, of course, was once a master. It's the famous aphorism that every hero eventually becomes the villain. And Poe, on the other hand, discovers that there is nothing to the scroll, that it is an empty and monstrous object, therefore creating the necessity of the transformation of his own failure to fight into its own success. Now, we've actually made the transition, unwittingly, between the concept of the monstrosity of Christ towards the obscene core of Christianity. The obscene core of Christianity is an argument from Chesterton. He argues that if you understand the concept of the monstrosity of Christ, i.e. the supposedly monstrous ineptitude of Christ as man, you have therefore understood what the obscene core of Christianity is. The obscene core of Christianity, to put it in Lacanian terms, is that there is no secret. Or, as Lacan says, if there is a secret, then it is that there is precisely no secret. The obscene core of Christianity is therefore synonymous with the dragon scroll in Kung Fu Panda, which is that there is nothing in it. There is nothing there. The scroll is empty. God is dead. God, in his eternal silence, is therefore empty. And this means that it is up to us to fill in that space. This means that, strictly speaking, to go back to Zizek's original argument that to be a Christian today is to be an atheist, is that there is an atheist core within the New Testament position, which once again is not that God is dead or that God doesn't exist and that we therefore have to live as if there were a God, but the other way around. God dies not for us. God dies for himself. God is actualized or transposed into the body of Christ, i.e. into the human community. Therefore, the redemption is not something that occurs after the crucifixion, but occurs within the crucifixion. Or, as Hegel puts it, what dies on the cross is not the body of Christ, but the idea of the Father in the sky, of an omnipotent deity. In fact, the famous moment in which Christ himself, for a moment, appears to doubt God, asking God to save him, asking why he has been forsaken by God. Father, why have you forsaken me? Is therefore the obscene core of Christianity, the atheist kernel that lies at the heart of the renewal of the faith into the Trinity and the logic of the New Testament. Therefore, it's important to note that the New Testament is not a sequel to the Old Testament, but in fact, a revolutionary upheaval of the very underlying logic of the Old Testament. If the Old Testament was a strictly speaking idealist work in the Platonic sense, namely, for Plato, we have the allegory of the cave, in which those who are in the cave live in the world of illusions and appearances, i.e. of falsehood and materiality, and the God exists in truth, in the ideal form, or pure form, the truth which exists outside the cave. Therefore, the purpose of idealism and the idealist subject is to be liberated from the cave and to enter into communion with God. These are some of the Platonic principles that continue to exist within the Old Testament and the early Christian faith, which is that we essentially have a ladder between fallen man, Adam and Eve, who are cast out of the Garden of Eden as it were, and the idea of a man who is reunited with God, who enters into heaven. This means that we have a cosmic staircase, as it were, between the world below and the world above. And God is the figurehead of everything that lies above, the guarantor, if you will, of the ideal, whereas man finds himself at the beginning of a cosmic board game where he has to reach the end. This means that we have, strictly speaking, a binary logic that is implicit in the Old Testament. It's a logic of order, whereby God imposes order on the chaos of existence. what happens in the New Testament is that God himself is thrown into chaos. And of course, what is chaos if not suffering, that which undermines our certainties? God himself suffers on the cross. And therefore, instead of imposing order from above, it is man who is left to impose order through the community of the faithful. Thereby, it is no longer God who is redeeming man, it is man who is redeeming God, i.e., therefore, man who redeems himself. This means that there's an atheist core at the very foundational logic of the New Testament. The reason that I stated that the New Testament is therefore not a sequel to the Old Testament is that it doesn't continue according to the principles that the Old Testament sets up. In fact, it completely eradicates them. It completely contradicts them. The New Testament is a surprisingly revolutionary document. The Old Testament, of course, and its ideology still functions within a world that would make sense for the Gentiles and the Romans, in which we have the idea of the gods above who move in mysterious ways, and a fallen man who tries to deduce what the gods want or achieve favor from the gods. The Romans were therefore quite correct to be scandalized by what would become the Christian faith, because the Christian faith implies that it is not enough to appease the gods through sacrifice, that there is no order that exists, and of course order didn't exactly exist for the Romans either, but that there is no divinity that has to somehow be assuaged by man. Now we can combine the two concepts, the monstrosity of Christ and the obscene core of Christianity. In both cases, where the arguments risk becoming provocative, perhaps unnecessarily so, is in the loaded use of the terms monstrous and obscene, both of which are terms that, at least in the popular vernacular, i.e. not in theoretical jargon-laden conceptual terms, are seen as normative, i.e. as indicators of a bad state of affairs. Something which is monstrous is therefore considered bad, as opposed to something which is natural, let's say. And something which is obscene is considered perverted, as opposed to something, once again, natural. However, it's important to note that the terms monstrous and obscene in this content do not denote normative terms. After all, the idea of a normative scale of evaluation would itself be indicative of what you might therefore call the Old Testament logic, the high and the low, the sacred and the profane. Inasmuch as the New Testament implies that the supposedly profane, i.e. ordinary, inept man, i.e. Jesus as Christ on the cross, would be elevated to the level of the highest. Therefore, the highest becomes the lowest on the cross. There is a profanity to Christ in this precise sense. A profanity that would scandalize the Romans, who would mock the early Christians by saying, "You worship a corpse on a cross." It's almost synonymous to if you walked into a cult-like room today where people would worship someone on an electric chair. It would be considered vulgar and low. Certainly not a representation of the highest, but a representation of the supposedly lowest. And yet, this is of course precisely the logic of the Old Testament that the New Testament is seeking to overcome. If the logic of the Old Testament is that we have the highest juxtaposed with the lowest, and that therefore the purpose of life is to reunite the lowest with the highest, therefore to eliminate the lowest, what occurs in the New Testament is a complete transposition of the high and the low, a transposition of the high into the low, as it were. Therefore, God becomes transposed into the profane, into the fallen, into man. God becomes more like us, instead of us becoming more like God. Hence, again, the Trinity that Zizek proposes, which I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, whereby we go from a God of unity towards a God of retribution or wrath, and then a God of suffering. And it is this God of suffering who is the God who is like us. Now, once again, we have these two terms. We have the monstrosity of Christ and we have the obscene core of Christianity. Now we can understand how both the term monstrous and obscene, whilst appearing to be normative representations of the lowest, therefore become indicators of what is in fact the highest, the sacred as the profane, as it were. Therefore, the monstrosity of Christ becomes synonymous with the beauty or the grace or the power of Christ. It is precisely because Christ is monstrously inept that he is the divinity, that he is like us. And it is precisely because the core of Christianity is obscene, namely the idea or notion of atheism, a God who for a moment on the cross does not even believe in himself, who abandons and forsakes himself on behalf of us, is therefore the highest form of truth. This means that in the New Testament, we are liberated, as it were, from the logic of Plato's allegory of the cave. The cave for Plato is monstrous. The cave is obscene. The shadows cast upon the cave wall by the fires that lay behind our backs are obscene. They distract us from the truth. And yet in the New Testament, these obscenities, these shadows and appearances become the truth. Therefore, there's a much more radical gesture implicit to the New Testament than there is even in contemporary atheism. Contemporary atheism doesn't go far enough. In rejecting the existence of God and trying to debate it on the level of empirics, we essentially uphold the notion of a provable God, a God who would be the ideal, the God in the sky, the all-knowing Heavenly Father. This characterization of God as an abstraction that is all-powerful or mysterious, therefore persists within most contemporary atheisms. Even enlightened scientists like to say that the universe is so mysterious that there must be something like God, and yet this precisely misses the point. This would be the cosmic God of unity and all that which cannot be known, i.e. the first in the trinity of gods. To reimpose the notion of God as being all that cannot be known, all that is mysterious and wondrous, is therefore precisely a simplification or a reduction of God that does not take into account the truly radical nature of the New Testament, which precisely de-idealizes God. The sublimation of God in the New Testament is, strictly speaking, the de-sublimation, the process by which God becomes not the ideal, but the fallen, the lowly, like us, in us, with us, for us. The Trinity and the Holy Spirit is therefore not a kind of guardian angel who moves in mysterious ways, who has a predetermined path that allows us to find enlightenment. The Holy Spirit is sublime in its failure. It is an emanation, not of one, but of three in one, of something that is irredeemable, that is irreducibly split, as it were. And therefore, if irreducibly split, then constitutively so. The Holy Spirit, in that sense, becomes a form of constitutive negativity, of implicit negation. Think about the transition between German idealism and materialism. Usually it's taught in the following way. Usually it's taught that German idealists were all metaphysical, solipsistic mysticists, and that materialism supposedly brought them back down to earth and created a more worldly way of approaching these problems through political economy, etc., Marxism. And yet it's almost the other way around. If you consider the commodity fetish, which we talked about last week, one of Marx's core constitutive concepts, the central insight of the commodity fetish, perhaps the materialist insight, is that it's precisely not about material objects as they are. It's about the supposedly magical, i.e. abstract qualities that emerge through the exchange of objects. Therefore, strictly speaking, the definition of a commodity, as I explained last week, is precisely that it becomes idealized, that it is no longer simply material, that it becomes something more than just what it is. The commodity, therefore, is the object cast in the light of its own exchange value with other objects, i.e. other commodities. Therefore, materialism isn't about bringing the ideal back down to reality, but precisely about pointing how the ideal functions precisely in what appears to us as material reality. Something similar can be said, once again, for the logic implicit in the New Testament. The New Testament isn't about demystifying God to focus on material things. When I say that there's an emphasis on the community of the faithful, I don't mean that it is, well, together we must create our own gods and we must create our own laws. After all, this would be an atheist argument, the atheist position being that God is dead and therefore we are left to ourselves. The argument instead is that it is precisely in the supposedly post-evental, post-New Testament, post-crucifixion world of pure materiality that the ideal persists, that the ideal is incubated, as it were. There's some other things I'd like to bring in here, but I want to stay a little bit focused. We could talk about the parables of Christ, etc., but there's really no point. Instead, we should start wrapping up here. So what I've introduced here are two notions that are core to Zizek's thinking about theology. Namely, the monstrosity of Christ and the obscenity of Christianity, or the obscene core of Christianity. Both of those concepts, once you understand them, help you conceptualize why Zizek argues that he is a Christian atheist. Namely, he emphasizes the atheist position within Christianity, and if you will, vice versa, how there remains an Old Testament, namely outdated Christian notion to most contemporary atheism. Of course, Zizek here isn't arguing that one should become Christian or a practicing Christian. Certainly Zizek himself would not characterize himself as such. Instead, the argument here is a Chestertonian one about the highest and the lowest, about the sacred and the profane, about the inversion that occurs, whereby, as Hegel puts it once again, what dies on the cross is not the body of Christ, but the God of the beyond, the God of the omnipotent Father in the sky. And the reason that Zizek is interested in this is because it, of course, contributes to his overall philosophical project, which is the study of German idealism, specifically Hegelianism. And so when Zizek talks about Christianity, he is essentially engaged in a Hegelian approach to the ideal. And this is where I want to wrap up, which is that what you may have heard from me before is that Hegel is the first post-metaphysical thinker, i.e., Hegel is the first philosopher to create a system, namely the system of the dialectic, as it were, which escapes the binary trappings of a Platonic metaphysical system, allegory of the cave. Now, Kant, and I've explained this before, and there's no time here, but Kant was really the first one to undermine the logical possibilities of the Platonic system. The critique of pure reason is meant as an empirical, Humean, skeptical inquiry into the logical coordinates of Platonic idealism. And Kant essentially argues that it's broken, that if the ideal has to be conceptualized through reason, then strictly speaking, it is therefore no longer ideal. Therefore, reason, which is supposed to be, if you will, the ladder upon which the rungs of conceptual logic would allow us to ascend to the highest, are therefore precisely the things that keep us away from the highest. This is a deeply depressing insight for Kant. In fact, so traumatic that Kant has to disavow this knowledge. He disavows it by means of the creation of the concept of things in themselves, an ideal pure form that exists beyond the realm of human consciousness, that cannot be known, that cannot be tainted through reason. Hegel looks at this and, to simplify greatly, says, what if this binary of the highest and the lowest in fact mirrors the Christian logic? What if the things in themselves, namely the lowest material objects, which behind the veneer of their appearances are supposed to contain the ideal substance of their truth, the pure form, what if these are synonymous with the things in themselves? In other words, what if the highest is transposed into the lowest? What if reason is not the barrier or the antithesis to the ideal? What if reason, precisely in its antinomical, fallen state, is the highest in its own sublation, in its own dialectical, i.e. constitutive negation? Therefore, to simplify, but I think this can be really helpful, Hegel, as a Christian thinker, because let's not forget that Hegel is a deeply Christian thinker, Hegel interprets the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and specifically the crucifixion and the idea of Christ, in such a way that allows him to transpose it onto the metaphysical relationship between Platonic idealism, Kantian idealism, which of course is a skeptical idealism, in that sense, critical idealism, and his own post-metaphysical system. Therefore, one could go as far as saying that Hegel achieves for philosophy what the New Testament achieves for Christianity. It introduces a post-metaphysical option. I mean, the word option here is perhaps not the best chosen one, because it's a necessity, as it were. It's not an option. After the New Testament, to go back to the logic of the Old Testament becomes an affectation. It becomes a disavowal of the traumatic content of the New Testament. Inasmuch as after Kant and Hegel, to go back to a Humean, empirical, analytic approach to metaphysics is a disavowal of the break that has occurred. It becomes an affectation. Therefore, when Hegel declares the end of philosophy, he's patently not declaring that there is a temporal end to philosophy. In fact, there's many instances in which Hegel actually talks about the future as if philosophy still existed. Instead, what Hegel means is that the post-metaphysical system ushers in the end of, if you will, the Old Testament logic of philosophy, the Old Testament logic of idealism, based on Platonic idealism. Therefore, the megalomania of Hegel is therefore to present himself as a Christ-like figure, as a figure who cannot be understood or imitated, but who has to be, but who through his own freedom liberates others. Hence, the transition that occurs in Hegel's thinking is that it goes from what appears at first to be a programmatic philosophy, which can be taught to anyone. Hegel wanted to create a school where his idealism could be taught to children. It undergoes a transition from this optimism, if you will, about the programmatic notion of metaphysics towards a much more Christian one, which is that it can't be taught. It can only be lived. And Hegel, in his Phenomenology of Spirit, invites the reader to live his metaphysics. Not in the normative sense that you create rules for life, but precisely that you go through the logical arguments that Hegel is making, and therefore at the end of it, actualize and understand his conclusions as if they were your own, as it were. Therefore, Hegel is not seeking acolytes. He's not seeking students who can simplify his work. Hegel wants radicals. Hegel wants people who don't just consume his works, as it were, as yet another philosophy to be considered against other philosophies. He wants it to be a total or a Gesamtphilosophie, a philosophy which in its implications, once properly understood, changed the very coordinates of reality, and therefore change the coordinates by which the incentive structures and the imagination as to what subjectivity in life can be change as well. And so we're back at Luffy. We're back at One Piece. In One Piece, Luffy doesn't try to set other people free by teaching them how to do it. Instead, he models it for them so that they can actualize it in themselves. Hegel, in his writing, no longer tries to teach. his ideas, he tries to live them, as it were, so that other people can actualize them in themselves. Therefore, the idea and the project of Hegelian post-metaphysics is not programmatic. In fact, one could argue that all of the post-Hegelian thinkers, both the left and the right Hegelians, have in a sense misinterpreted his work, and yet misinterpreted in a way that is fruitful, at least to the extent that even the misunderstandings are symptomatic to the way and the time in which they were created. In fact, I think one could argue that my own reading of Hegel is a failure, is a mischaracterization, is prone to the symptomatic restrictions of trying to teach Hegel online with others. But my hope is that in understanding Zizek's approach to Chesterton and to the dual concepts of the monstrosity of Christ and the obscene core of Christianity, that you can begin understanding some of the central tenets of Hegelianism, which to my mind remain incredibly beautiful, not just in an aesthetic sense, but in their possibility for transformation. And what I mean by a possibility for transformation is that they don't appeal in a way that Rules for Life might, which of course is once again, an Old Testament approach to life. Live like Jesus did, live like God would want you to. I should add, on a final note, this is why I reject Jordan Peterson's notion that Christ on the cross is an emblem of nihilism, that Christ invites us to gaze into the abyss, to go into darkness and suffering. The reason I reject this is because it applies an outdated Old Testament logic to the crucifixion. It fails to understand the revolutionary, i.e. obscene core of Christianity. Christ on the cross is not a figure to be emulated. Christ dies on behalf and for us, which means that he dies on behalf and for God. God dies for himself to liberate us. Therefore, any attempt to argue that the suffering of Christ has to be emulated creates all manner of nihilistic and sadomasochistic falsehoods that I would like to think are very dangerous indeed. And I would warn you against them. For me, the New Testament, for me, Hegelianism, is life-affirming. It's emancipatory. It's about choosing how to live by means of knowing what you are willing to die for, which I think is the central question of all existence. Who and what are you willing to die for so that you know what you are willing to live for? On that note, thank you so much for joining me this morning. It's been lovely starting my week in philosophical and theological fashion with you. And if you'd like to continue this conversation, I host a seminar for patrons, which I record live on Discord after every lecture, and I post as an audio podcast to Substack and Patreon. Thank you so much for being here this morning. Thank you for supporting this project, and I invite you all to join the learning community on Patreon. See you next week.